Amelia Davenport didn't arrive on the island like a millionairess taking a vacation. She arrived like a fugitive, her face pale and her hands clenched. This is a story about escaping a world that tries to own you and finding salvation where you least expect it. If you believe in our mission to unearth these stories of courage, consider supporting us with a super thanks. And if you already stand with Amelia, leave a "Stay strong, Amelia" in the comments below. The roar of the chartered fishing boat's engine was the sound of her old life being severed. With every wave, the salt-crusted vessel slapped. The city of Boston and the gilded cage of her existence within it receded further into the grey mist of the Atlantic. The year was 1959, and Amelia Davenport, at 32 years old, was the sole heiress to the Davenport Steel fortune, a name that was both a shield and a curse. For the last 6 months, that name had been synonymous with scandal, disaster, and death. Her father, a titan of industry with a reputation as hard and unyielding as the steel he forged, had died a year prior, leaving her in command of an empire she had never wanted. He had also left behind a legacy of cut corners and greased palms. That legacy had come crashing down 3 months ago, along with the half-finished structure of the new Tobin Bridge, a project built with Davenport Steel. A catastrophic structural failure, the newspapers called it. 12 men had been killed. The press, like a pack of wolves, had descended. They didn't care that she had been in charge for less than a year. Her face was on the cover of every magazine, her elegant, haunted features a symbol of corporate malfeasance. The Steel Princess, they called her, ruling over a kingdom of rust and ruin. Her father's old business partners, men who had profited from his corruption for decades, now circled her, feigning concern while plotting to wrest control of the company from her unsteady, feminine hands. She was trapped in a soundproof room of lawyers and accusations, her every move scrutinized, her grief for her father eclipsed by the public's demand for a scapegoat. So she had fled. She had constructed an elaborate fiction of a long, recuperative trip to Europe, leaking the details to the society pages herself. But instead of boarding a transatlantic liner, she had driven north, under an assumed name, to a small, forgotten fishing village on the coast of Maine. And from there she had paid a grizzled, incurious fisherman an exorbitant amount of cash to take her to St. Jude's Island. The island was a secret she had kept for years, a small 20-acre teardrop of granite and pine she had bought with her own money, a private act of rebellion against her father's world of concrete and steel. It was her one true possession, a place utterly untouched by the Davenport name. It had no electricity, no running water beyond a hand pump well, and a single rustic stone cottage that the fisherman had helped her stock with enough supplies to last 6 months. It was to be her sanctuary, her monastery, the place where Amelia Davenport, the Steel Princess, could disappear, and perhaps where a woman she no longer knew could be reborn. The first week was a brutal shock. The silence was the most aggressive presence. In Boston, her life had been a constant cacophony of ringing phones, of urgent meetings, of the relentless hum of a city and an empire. Here the only sounds were the shriek of the gulls, the sighing of the wind through the pines, and the rhythmic percussive crash of the waves against the rocky shore. It was a silence so profound it seemed to magnify the turmoil in her own mind, the headlines and accusations replaying in an endless, torturous loop. The simple physical demands of survival were a constant, humbling struggle. She, a woman who had never so much as dressed herself without the help of a maid, was now tasked with splitting firewood, with hauling buckets of water from the well, with cooking her meals over an open flame. Her hands, once soft and manicured, became raw and blistered. She was clumsy, incompetent, a stranger in her own body. Her vast fortune was meaningless here. She could not buy a solution to a smoky chimney or a leaking roof. For the first time in her life, she was truly, utterly on her own, and she was failing. She began to feel as though she were the only person left on earth, a solitary survivor in a post-apocalyptic world of her own making. The isolation she had craved was now a suffocating, terrifying presence. She would spend hours just sitting on the rocky cliffs, staring out at the vast, empty expanse of the ocean, feeling her own insignificance, her own loneliness, a feeling so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. The storm arrived at the end of her second week, a furious, black-hearted nor'easter that seemed to rise up from the sea with the express purpose of destroying her. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at the shingles of the cottage. The rain came down in horizontal sheets, blurring the world into a grey, watery chaos, and the waves, great monstrous mountains of black water, crashed against the island with a force that seemed to make the very granite tremble. Amelia huddled inside her small cottage, a fire sputtering in the hearth, the wind finding its way through every crack and crevice, a constant mournful whistle. She was terrified. This was not the metaphorical storm of the press and the boardrooms. This was a real, physical, elemental force, and it was a powerful, humbling reminder of her own fragility, her own powerlessness in the face of a world that was truly wild. It was sometime after midnight, in the deepest, darkest heart of the storm, when she saw it. Through the rain-lashed window she saw a light. It was on the far side of the island, a part she had not yet explored. It was not the flickering, uncertain light of a lantern. It was a steady, unwavering electric glow, a small, impossible pinprick of order, in the heart of the raging chaos. She stared at it, her mind reeling. Was she imagining it? Was she going mad? The fisherman had sworn the island was uninhabited, but the light was real. It was a beacon. It was proof that she was not alone. A new, desperate kind of energy surged through her. She had to get to that light. It was an irrational, primal instinct, the moth's desperate, suicidal flight toward the flame. To stay in the cottage felt like waiting for a slow, certain death. To move toward the light, however dangerous, felt like an act of life. She pulled on her heaviest coat and boots, wrapped a scarf around her head, and stepped out into the teeth of the storm. The force of the wind almost knocked her from her feet. The rain stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. Using a small, flickering flashlight, she began the treacherous journey across the island, stumbling over rocks, her feet sinking into the muddy, rain-saturated earth. The branches of the pine trees, whipped into a frenzy by the wind, clawed at her face and clothes. It was a nightmare journey that seemed to last for hours. Finally, through the driving rain, she saw the source of the light. It was not a house. It was a small, functional, military-looking structure, a single-story building of concrete and steel, with a tall, slender radio antenna rising from its roof, swaying violently in the wind but not breaking. The light came from a single, square window. She stumbled toward it, her body trembling with a mixture of cold, exhaustion, and a new, dawning apprehension. Who was here? What was this place? She reached the heavy steel door and pounded on it with her fist, her blows almost lost in the roar of the storm. For a long moment, nothing happened. She was about to give up, to slide down into a heap of exhausted despair on the doorstep, when she heard the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door swung inward. Framed in the warm, bright light of the doorway stood a man. He was a black man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple olive-drab fatigues of a soldier. His face was stern, etched with lines of a deep, quiet concentration, and his eyes, which were sharp and intelligent, widened slightly in a look of profound, controlled surprise. He was not expecting a visitor. Amelia stared at him, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. A soldier, a lone, black soldier, in a secret military outpost on her private, deserted island. The sheer, breathtaking improbability of it was too much for her frayed, exhausted mind to comprehend. He looked at her, taking in her appearance, her drenched, expensive coat, her face streaked with mud and tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He saw not a millionairess, but a survivor, a refugee washed up on his shore by the storm. He stood aside, holding the door open against the force of the wind. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unreadable, and spoke, his voice a low, calm rumble that was a stark, solid contrast to the howling chaos of the night. "You're a long way from wherever you're supposed to be, ma'am," he said. "I suggest you come inside." Stepping across the threshold of the steel door was like entering another dimension. The chaotic, roaring world of the storm was instantly shut out, replaced by a profound, humming silence. The air inside was warm, dry, and smelled of ozone, hot vacuum tubes, and brewing coffee. The space was not a home, it was a command center. A long workbench lined one wall, covered in a complex, intimidating array of radios, oscilloscopes, and other electronic equipment, their dials glowing with a soft green light. A bank of humming machinery stood against another wall, the source of the steady electric glow she had seen. It was a place of extreme order, of meticulous military precision, a stark, jarring contrast to the rustic, chaotic world of her stone cottage and the untamed wilderness of the island. The soldier closed the heavy door, the sound of the bolt sliding home a definitive, echoing thud that seemed to seal them off from the rest of the universe. He turned to her, his face still a mask of controlled, professional curiosity. He was a man accustomed to unexpected situations, a man trained not to panic, but to assess, to analyze. "I'm Sergeant Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice calm and even. "United States Air Force. And you are?" "Amelia," she managed to say, her own voice a reedy, unfamiliar whisper. Her teeth were chattering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor racking her body. She did not offer her last name. Davenport was a name that belonged to the other world, the world she had fled. Here, in this strange, humming sanctuary, she was just Amelia, a half-drowned refugee. He nodded, accepting her single-name answer without question. He was not interested in her identity, only in her immediate condition. "You're soaked through," he said, his tone practical, the voice of a man dealing with a logistical problem. "You'll catch your death if you stay in those clothes." He pointed to a small, curtained-off area at the back of the room. "There's a small head in there. And a clean towel. I can give you a spare uniform to wear while your clothes dry by the generator." His offer was so simple, so practical, it momentarily cut through the fog of her shock and confusion. She was not a woman to him, not an object of curiosity or threat. She was a civilian in distress, and he was a soldier, and a soldier's duty was to provide aid and comfort. She just nodded, unable to speak, and stumbled toward the curtained-off area. Behind the curtain was a small, Spartanly clean bathroom. She stripped off her wet, muddy, and ridiculously expensive clothes, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold. She dried herself with the rough, standard-issue towel and put on the uniform he had left for her, a simple set of olive-drab fatigues. The clothes were far too big for her, but they were warm, dry, and blessedly anonymous. As she looked at herself in the small, polished metal mirror, she saw not the haunted, elegant face of Amelia Davenport, the steel princess, but a pale, frightened stranger, a woman stripped of all her usual signifiers of wealth and status, dressed in the borrowed skin of a soldier. When she emerged, he had a steaming mug of black coffee waiting for her. He had hung her wet clothes on a makeshift line near the humming generators, the expensive fabric of her coat already steaming in the dry, warm air. "Drink this," he said, handing her the mug. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." She took the mug, her hands wrapping around it, desperate for its warmth. The coffee was strong, bitter, and the best thing she had ever tasted. He motioned for her to sit in a simple, straight-backed wooden chair, the only other piece of furniture in the room besides his own stool at the workbench. He did not sit with her. He returned to his post, a silent, watchful sentinel. He sat with his back to her, monitoring his equipment, his movements economical and precise. He seemed to have already accepted her presence as a new, unexpected variable in his orderly world, a variable that had been assessed, secured, and now required no further immediate action. His quiet, professional disregard was, in its own way, a profound comfort. He was not trying to comfort her, not trying to question her. He was simply allowing her the space to recover, to breathe. As the warmth of the coffee began to seep into her bones, and the immediate, life-or-death terror of the storm began to recede, 1,000 questions began to swirl in Amelia's mind. Who was this man? What was this place? What was a United States Air Force sergeant doing in a secret radio outpost on her private island? "I don't understand," she said, her voice finally returning, stronger now. I own this island. I was told it was uninhabited. He turned on his stool to face her, his expression unreadable. The island is uninhabited, ma'am, he said, for all official civilian purposes. This facility, he gestured to the room around them, does not officially exist. It is a long-range weather and communications monitoring station, part of the DO line, the distant early warning line. Amelia had read about it in the newspapers. It was a string of radar and radio stations in the far north, designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. But what was a station doing here, so far south, off the coast of Maine? As if reading her mind, he added, "This is a supplementary station. We monitor submarine communications and low-altitude atmospheric conditions. Our primary mission is to listen and to be invisible." "Our mission?" she asked, seizing on the plural. "Are there others here?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Just me. It's a solitary posting. 6 months on, 2 weeks off." The thought of it was staggering. 6 months, alone, in this small, humming concrete box, surrounded by the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. Her own self-imposed exile of 2 weeks suddenly seemed like a child's game, a brief, amateurish flirtation with a loneliness that this man inhabited as his full-time profession. "Why?" she asked, the question a simple, heartfelt expression of her disbelief. He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something personal, something beyond the professional soldier, entered his eyes. "Because it's my job," he said simply, "and because I'm good at it. The quiet doesn't bother me, I prefer it." In his quiet preference for solitude, Amelia felt a strange, unexpected kinship. She, too, had sought out the quiet, had craved an escape from the noise of her life. But she had been running away from a world that was trying to destroy her. This man, she sensed, was not running away. He was running towards something, toward a sense of purpose, of order, of a quiet, disciplined mastery of his small, isolated world. The storm raged on outside, a wild, chaotic symphony of wind and water, but inside the small concrete station, a strange, quiet peace had settled. They sat in a comfortable silence, two strangers, a fugitive millionairess and a solitary soldier, brought together by the fury of the storm. "What about you, ma'am?" he asked after a long while, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a woman like you to a place like this? It's not exactly a tourist destination." The question was direct, but not accusatory. It was the simple, logical inquiry of a man trying to make sense of an anomaly. And Amelia, to her own surprise, found that she wanted to tell him. She wanted to unburden herself of the story she had been carrying alone for so long. Here, in this anonymous, non-existent place, with this stranger who did not know her name, who did not know the toxic, heavy weight of the word Davenport, she felt for the first time safe enough to tell the truth. So she told him. She told him everything. She spoke of her father, of the steel empire, of the bridge collapse, of the 12 men who had died. She spoke of the press, the lawyers, the partners who were circling like sharks. She spoke of her flight, her desperate, ill-conceived attempt to escape, to find a place where she could simply breathe. He listened, as he had before, with a profound, unwavering attention. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He just listened, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on her face, his expression one of a deep, quiet empathy. He was a man who understood the concepts of duty, of honor, of a legacy that could be both a burden and a sacred trust. When she finished, her story hanging in the warm, dry air between them, he was silent for a long time. "It seems to me, ma'am," he said finally, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble, "that you've been fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against your father's enemies and one against his ghost." His words were a revelation, a simple, profound truth that cut through the noise of her own guilt and confusion. She had been so consumed by the public scandal, by the fight for the company, that she had not allowed herself to truly grieve, to separate the man she had loved from the flawed, corrupt legacy he had left behind. "I don't know how to fight," she whispered, the admission a confession of her deepest insecurity. "I'm not a soldier. I'm just a woman who was left in charge of a mess she didn't create." "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, and a small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Anyone who can survive a nor'easter in a stone cottage and then cross this island in the middle of the night is a soldier. You just haven't been properly trained." His words, his simple, unqualified validation of her own resilience, were a gift. He did not see her as a poor, helpless rich girl. He saw her as a survivor. In his eyes, for the first time in a long time, she saw a reflection of a woman who was not weak, but strong. The storm began to subside in the hours before dawn. The howling of the wind, gentle to a low, mournful sigh. The hammering of the rain against the roof softened to a steady, rhythmic patter. A new, exhausted quiet settled over the island. Amelia, wrapped in a spare army blanket, had fallen asleep in her chair, the emotional and physical ordeal of the night finally catching up with her. Sergeant Marcus Thorne sat at his workbench watching her. This strange, unexpected woman, who had literally washed up on his doorstep, had breached the walls of his carefully constructed solitude. For months, his world had been one of signals, of codes, of the disembodied electronic voices of pilots and submarine commanders. She was the first human being he had spoken to, face to face, in over 3 months. Her presence was a disruption, a complication, but it was also, he was surprised to admit to himself, a welcome one. He was a man who had chosen a life of quiet, lonely duty. But as he looked at this sleeping, vulnerable, and surprisingly resilient woman, he felt a flicker of a feeling he had thought was long dead, the simple, profound, and deeply human need for connection. He had rescued her from the storm, but he had a strange, unsettling feeling that she, in her own way, had just rescued him too. Amelia awoke to the smell of frying bacon and the unfamiliar, comforting sound of a world at peace. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a scrubbed, clean silence. The sun, a pale, watery gold, was streaming through the single square window of the communications station, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the memory of the storm, of her desperate flight, of the soldier, came rushing back. She sat up, the rough wool of the army blanket scratching against her chin. Sergeant Thorne was standing at a small, makeshift galley he had set up in a corner of the room, a single hot plate powered by the generators. He was a figure of intense, domestic concentration, expertly flipping bacon in a small cast-iron skillet. The sight of this formidable, disciplined soldier engaged in such a simple, comforting act was so unexpected, so deeply human, that it brought a small, involuntary smile to her face. He seemed to sense her looking at him. He turned, a spatula in his hand. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in the heart of the storm. "I figured you might be hungry. Scrambled eggs are the only other thing on the menu, I'm afraid. The supply plane isn't due for another 2 weeks." "That sounds wonderful," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. He served the breakfast on 2 plain military-issue metal plates. They sat at a small fold-out table he had erected, the two of them, the fugitive millionairess and the solitary soldier, sharing a simple meal in their strange, accidental bubble of existence. The food was basic, but to Amelia, who had been subsisting on canned beans and stale crackers for 2 weeks, it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. As they ate, a new, slightly awkward dynamic settled between them. The life-or-death urgency of the storm had created a kind of battlefield intimacy. Now, in the calm, clear light of day, they were once again 2 strangers from 2 vastly different worlds, forced to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of their shared solitude. Amelia looked out the window at the world the storm had left behind. The island was a scene of devastation. Great, ancient pine trees had been snapped in 2 like matchsticks. The ground was littered with a thick carpet of fallen branches. The sea, though calmer now, was still a churning, angry grey, great swells of water crashing against the rocks and sending plumes of white spray high into the air. "My cottage," she said, a new wave of anxiety washing over her. "I have to see if it's still standing." "It'll be there," he said with a quiet confidence. "Those old stone buildings were made to last, but the path will be a mess. "You should wait, rest. You've been through a lot." But Amelia was not a woman who was good at waiting. The simple physical act of doing something, of moving, of assessing the damage, felt like a necessary antidote to the helpless, passive terror of the night before. "No," she said, a new, unfamiliar resolve in her voice. I need to know what I'm facing." He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, and he saw the same steely determination he had seen in the eyes of young officers on their first command. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "All right then," he said, "but you're not going alone, and you're not going in those fancy ruined boots. I have a spare pair that might fit." An hour later, they set out to survey the damage. The army-issue boots he had given her were heavy and clunky, but they were sturdy and waterproof, and as she laced them up, she felt a strange sense of being properly equipped for the first time since her arrival. He handed her a heavy-duty machete. "For the path," he explained. "You'll need it." He carried a larger, more formidable one himself. The journey back across the island was a revelation. In the clear light of day, she could see the full, breathtaking extent of the storm's fury. The familiar, winding path to her cottage had disappeared, completely obliterated by a tangled, impenetrable mess of fallen trees and debris. Without a word, Sergeant Thorne began to work. He moved with a quiet, efficient, and almost beautiful economy of motion. The machete in his hands was not a weapon of violence, but a tool of creation, an instrument of order. He did not hack wildly at the branches. He assessed, he analyzed, and then he cut, each swing of the blade precise, purposeful, clearing a new path inch by painstaking inch through the chaos. Amelia watched for a moment, mesmerized by his competence, and then she followed his lead. She began to swing her own smaller machete, her movements at first clumsy and ineffective, but he would pause, and without a word, would adjust her grip, correct her stance, show her how to use the weight of the blade to her advantage. He was a natural teacher, his instructions conveyed not through words, but through a quiet, shared physical language. They worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, the rhythmic thwack of their blades the only sound in the post-storm quiet. Amelia, a woman whose hands had been trained for the delicate, intricate work of embroidery and piano playing, discovered a new, surprising strength in her own body. The repetitive physical labor was grueling, but it was also deeply satisfying. With every branch she cleared, every obstacle she overcame, she felt a small, hard kernel of her old, helpless self being chipped away, replaced by something new, something stronger, something more resilient. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a participant in her own survival. It took them over 3 hours to clear the path to her cottage. As he had predicted, the small stone building was still standing, a sturdy, defiant bastion against the storm's fury. A few shingles were missing from the roof, and a window had been shattered, but it was fundamentally intact. For the rest of the day, they worked to repair the damage. He showed her how to mix mortar to seal the cracks in the stone, how to board up the broken window, how to climb onto the roof and secure the loose shingles. He was a man of infinite practical knowledge, a man who understood the fundamental principles of how the world was put together and how to fix it when it broke. As they worked, they began to talk. The shared, focused labor broke down the last of their reserve. He spoke of his childhood in rural Georgia, the son of a sharecropper, of his escape into the army, the one place where a poor black man could be judged not on the color of his skin, but on his skill, his courage, his competence. He spoke of the loneliness of his current posting, but also of the strange monastic peace he found in it, the satisfaction of a difficult job done well. Amelia, in turn, found herself speaking of her own gilded cage, of the suffocating loneliness of a life of immense privilege, but of little personal freedom. She spoke of her father, of her complicated love for a man who was both a brilliant, charismatic visionary and a ruthless, corrupt tyrant. She spoke of her own feelings of inadequacy, of her fear that she was not strong enough, not smart enough to manage the empire he had left her. "My father," she said as they sat on the cottage steps taking a break, "he used to say that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, hammers and nails. He was a hammer. He thought I was a nail." Sergeant Thorne looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "With all due respect to your father, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He was wrong. The world isn't about hammers and nails. It's about building things, and a good builder knows how to use both. You need the hammer to drive the nail, but you need the nail to hold the structure together. One is useless without the other. His simple, profound wisdom was, once again, a revelation. She had spent her whole life seeing the world through her father's brutal binary lens, a world of winners and losers, of the strong and the weak. This quiet, solitary soldier was offering her a new way of seeing, a world of interdependence, of collaboration, of a strength that was not about breaking things, but about holding them together. In the days that followed, a new routine, a new life, began to take shape on the small, isolated island. They were no longer two solitary individuals. They were a team, a small, self-sufficient community of two. In the mornings, they would work together, clearing the rest of the island, repairing the damage from the storm. In the afternoons, he would return to his station to do his work, to listen to the silent, invisible whispers of the world, and she would read, or walk, or simply sit on the cliffs, her mind for the first time in a long time quiet and at peace. In the evenings, she would come to the station and they would share a meal. They would talk for hours, their conversations a rich, fascinating tapestry of their two vastly different lives. He would tell her about the stars, which he knew with an astronomer's intimate knowledge. She would tell him about the art and the music she loved. He was a man of science and of practicalities. She was a woman of art and of ideas. And in the space between their two worlds, they found a rich, fertile ground of shared curiosity and mutual respect. Amelia found herself changing in small, profound ways. The helplessness that had defined her was being replaced by a new, quiet competence. She learned how to start a fire with a single match, how to read a weather map, how to mend a fishing net. She was learning the fundamental, essential skills of survival, and in doing so, she was discovering a strength and a resourcefulness she never knew she possessed. The island was no longer her prison, it was her training ground. And Sergeant Marcus Thorne was not her jailer. He was her drill instructor, her teacher, her unexpected and profoundly decent friend. He, in turn, was being changed by her. Her presence had breached the walls of his solitude, letting in a light and a warmth that he had not realized he was missing. Her intelligence, her curiosity, her quiet, resilient strength all challenged his preconceived notions of her world. She was not the fragile, helpless aristocrat he had first imagined. She was a woman of substance, a woman of courage, a woman who, like him, was simply trying to find an honorable way to navigate a difficult, complicated world. The quiet, he was beginning to realize, was no longer something he preferred. The sound of her voice, her laughter, had become a welcome, essential part of the island's new, richer music. The rhythm of their shared life on the island was governed by the simple, elemental forces of the sun, the tides, and the steady, demanding work of survival. For Amelia, this new existence was a stripping away of a lifetime of artifice. Back in Boston, her identity had been a construct, a thing built of brand names, of social connections, of the heavy, suffocating weight of the Davenport name. On the island, these things were meaningless. Here, a person's worth was measured not by their bank account, but by their ability to split a log cleanly, to mend a net, to read the subtle, shifting language of the clouds. She discovered, to her own astonishment, that she was a capable, resourceful person. Under Marcus's patient, understated tutelage, she became a student of the island. She learned to identify the edible plants that grew in the thin, rocky soil. She learned the habits of the seabirds, the patterns of the tides. She learned the profound, calming satisfaction of a day of hard physical labor, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a body tired from useful work. The blisters on her hands, which had once been a source of shame, were now a badge of honor, a testament to her own growing competence. Marcus, for his part, found his own carefully constructed world being quietly, irrevocably altered. He had chosen this solitary posting as a refuge, a place where the complex, exhausting negotiations of being a black man in a white world did not apply. Here, he was judged only by his ability to do his job. He was a master of his small, electronic kingdom, a man who found a deep, satisfying peace in the predictable logic of his machines. Amelia's presence was an intrusion of the unpredictable, the illogical, the deeply, wonderfully human. She brought with her not just her story and her vulnerability, but also her intelligence, her wit, her unexpected dry humor. She would challenge his assumptions. She would ask him questions about his work that forced him to explain it in new, simpler ways. She would sit with him in the evenings, reading a book of poetry aloud, her cultured musical voice a strange and beautiful counterpoint to the sterile electronic hum of his equipment. He found himself looking forward to their shared evenings, to the simple ritual of their shared meal, to their long, meandering conversations. He, a man who had chosen a life of silence, now found himself talking more than he had in years. He spoke to her of his dreams, of the life he had imagined for himself before the quiet pragmatism of his circumstances had led him to the army. He had wanted to be an astronomer, to spend his life studying the vast, silent, orderly dance of the cosmos. It was a dream he had long ago packed away, like a treasured but impractical keepsake. "Why didn't you?" she asked him one evening, her gaze direct and serious. He just shrugged, a gesture of resignation. There weren't a lot of universities in Georgia in the 1940s that were handing out scholarships in astrophysics to the sons of sharecroppers, he said, the statement simple, matter-of-fact, and utterly devastating in its quiet indictment of the world he had come from. In moments like these, Amelia was powerfully, painfully reminded of the vast, unbridgeable chasm of experience that separated them. She'd been born into a world of infinite possibility, a world where any dream, any ambition was considered her birthright. He had been born into a world where the doors to his own dreams had been locked and barred before he had even had a chance to knock. The injustice of it was a physical ache in her chest. Their friendship deepened, evolving from one of mentor and student, of rescuer and survivor, into a true partnership of equals. They were two intelligent, solitary people who had, through the most improbable of circumstances, found in each other a kindred spirit, a person who understood their own quiet internal landscape. A new, unspoken, and deeply terrifying tenderness began to grow between them. It was in the way he would instinctively reach out to steady her as they climbed over a slippery rock, his hand warm and strong on her arm. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of fish from their dinner, a small, unspoken gesture of affection. It was in the long, charged silences that would sometimes fall between them, silences that were filled with a meaning that neither of them was yet brave enough to name. The outside world, the world of Davenport Steel and the scandal, seemed a million miles away. Amelia had been on the island for over a month. The fisherman who had brought her was scheduled to return in 5 more. The thought of leaving, of returning to that other life, filled her with a profound, suffocating dread. She had found a kind of peace here, a sense of her own true self that she had never known before. To return to Boston would be to put back on the heavy, ill-fitting costume of Amelia Davenport, the Steel Princess. The crisis that would force her hand, that would shatter their isolated, idyllic existence, came not from the sea or the sky, but through the crackling, static-filled airwaves of Marcus's radio. He was at his post one afternoon, monitoring the routine chatter of military frequencies, when he intercepted a stray, non-military broadcast. It was a news report from a Boston radio station, its signal weak and distorted, but the words were clear enough to make his blood run cold. The search for Amelia Davenport, the missing heiress to the Davenport Steel fortune, has intensified today, the announcer's voice crackled. Sources close to the family say they are deeply concerned, as she has not been heard from in over a month. Meanwhile, a special prosecutor has been appointed to investigate the Tobin Bridge disaster, and a grand jury is expected to issue a subpoena for Miss Davenport's testimony. Authorities say that if she does not present herself to the court, a warrant will be issued for her arrest, and she will be considered a fugitive from justice. Marcus sat frozen, the words echoing in the silent humming room. A fugitive, a warrant for her arrest. The wolves she had fled from were not just circling anymore, they were closing in for the kill. He knew with a terrible, sinking certainty that her self-imposed exile was over. She could not hide here forever. To stay on the island would be to become a true fugitive, to cede the battle, to let her father's enemies win. He had to tell her. He walked out of the station and across the island to her cottage, his steps heavy, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He found her on the cliffs, sitting on her favorite perch, staring out at the sea, her face calm and peaceful. The sight of her, so serene, so unaware of the storm that was about to break over her life once again, was almost more than he could bear. He told her, his voice low and gentle, repeating the words from the radio broadcast as kindly as he could. He watched as the peace drained from her face, replaced by the old familiar mask of fear and haunted anxiety. The sanctuary they had built together was dissolving before his eyes, the harsh, ugly realities of the outside world crashing in on them. "So that's their plan," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. "They're not just trying to take the company. They're trying to put me in prison." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. "They will, won't they? They'll say I ran away because I was guilty. They'll twist this, my attempt to find some peace, into an admission of a crime." He could not lie to her. "They will try," he said, his voice grim. "Men like that, they don't fight fair. They will use any weapon they can." She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the distant, unforgiving horizon. He could see the battle being waged within her, the desire to stay, to hide, to remain in this safe, simple world, warring with the knowledge that she could not. He had seen this same look in the eyes of young soldiers facing their first real combat, the moment when the abstract idea of duty collides with the terrifying, visceral reality of the fight. If Amelia's quiet resolve in this moment has touched your heart, her decision to turn and face the storm she had fled, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue to honor souls as strong and resilient as hers. "You taught me how to survive on this island, Marcus," she said finally, her voice quiet but full of a new, hard-won strength. "You taught me how to build a fire, how to find my way in the dark, but you also taught me that a soldier doesn't run from a fight, not when it's a fight that matters." She stood up, her small frame silhouetted against the vast, empty sky. "I have to go back," she said, the words a simple, powerful declaration of intent. "I have to face them. I will not let them destroy my father's name, and I will not let them destroy mine. I am not a nail. I am not a fugitive. I am the president of Davenport Steel, and it's time I started acting like it." Her transformation was complete. The frightened, helpless woman who had washed up on his shore in the middle of a storm was gone. In her place stood a leader, a fighter, a woman who had, in the crucible of this wild, lonely island, finally, truly found herself. "When does the supply boat come?" she asked, her tone now brisk, all business. "The fisherman?" he said, momentarily taken aback by her sudden shift. "He's not due for another 5 weeks." "Then we'll have to find another way," she said, her mind already working, analyzing the new tactical situation. "Your radio. Can you use it to call for a boat?" "It's for military frequencies only," he said. "To use it for a civilian purpose would be a serious breach of protocol. I could be court-martialed." She looked at him, and her expression softened. "You've already done so much for me, Marcus. Risked so much. I can't ask you to risk your career." He met her gaze, and in that moment, the last of his professional reserve, the last wall he had built around his own heart, crumbled. He had come to this island to serve his country, to do his duty, but he now understood that his duty, his truest and most profound duty, was to this woman. His carefully ordered, solitary world had been turned upside down, and he would not have it any other way. "Amelia," he said, the first time he had ever used her name. "My mission here is to monitor for threats, and you, ma'am, are currently a friendly civilian in a compromised position. It is my duty to see you safely back to a secure location. I'll make the call." His words were a quiet, simple declaration, but they were the most profound and deeply personal words he had ever spoken. He was choosing her. He was choosing to step out of the shadows of his quiet, lonely life and to enter her chaotic, dangerous one. He was no longer just her teacher, her friend. He was her ally, and they were about about to go to war together. The decision to leave the island was a declaration of war, and their final days together were spent preparing for the coming battle. The atmosphere in the small, humming communications station shifted from one of quiet, domestic peace to the focused, purposeful energy of a military command post. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a commander and her most trusted advisor, a strategist and her field operative, planning their re-entry into the hostile territory of the civilized world. Marcus, using a secure, coded frequency, made the call. He did not radio the Coast Guard or any civilian authority. He radioed his own commanding officer at a secure Air Force base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He kept his transmission brief, professional, and deliberately vague. He reported a civilian medical emergency on a nearby, uncharted fishing outpost and requested an immediate, discreet medical evacuation by helicopter. He knew that the mention of an uncharted location would trigger a specific protocol, one designed to avoid public records and minimize official inquiry. He was using the military's own obsession with secrecy to his advantage. His commanding officer, a man who trusted Sergeant Thorne's judgment implicitly, asked no questions and simply confirmed that a helicopter would be dispatched at dawn. With their transport secured, they turned their attention to the next phase of the operation, the legal and public relations battle that awaited Amelia in Boston. This was a war that would not be fought with machetes and survival skills, but with information, with evidence, and with a carefully crafted narrative. "They will paint you as a coward who ran away," Marcus said, his voice grim as they sat at the small table, a map of the New England coast spread out between them, a makeshift war room table. "They will say you are unstable, hysterical, and incompetent woman who cracked under the pressure. We need to control the story. We need to go on the offensive." Amelia, her mind now sharp and clear, her fear transmuted into a cold, focused anger, listened intently. She was no longer the frightened, overwhelmed heiress. She was the CEO of Davenport Steel, and she was beginning to think like one. "My father," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "was a complicated man. He was a brilliant industrialist, but he was also a man who cut corners. He had a private ledger, a secret one. He kept it in a hidden safe in his study. It contained a record of all his unofficial business, the bribes, the kickbacks, the deals he made in the shadows. I found it after he died. I was so horrified, so ashamed, I just hid it away. I couldn't bring myself to look at it." Marcus's eyes lit up. "A ledger," he said, his voice a low, excited whisper. "Amelia, that's not just a weapon. That's a nuke. It's the proof. It's the evidence that the corruption in the company didn't start with you. It was a legacy you inherited, a mess you were trying to clean up. But it's in the safe," she said, a note of despair in her voice. "In the house in Boston, a house that is probably being watched by my father's old partners, by the press, by the district attorney." "Then we'll have to get it," Marcus said, his voice a simple, unshakable statement of fact. His mind, the mind of a soldier who had planned and executed 100 difficult missions, was already working, formulating a plan of infiltration and extraction. For the rest of the day, and long into the night, they planned. Amelia, with her intimate knowledge of the Boston house, of its layout, its staff, its security systems, was the intelligence officer. She drew a detailed map of the estate from memory, marking the location of the safe, the best points of entry, the patterns of the night watchman. Marcus, with his tactical expertise, translated her intelligence into a workable plan. He would not go in with her. It was too risky. He would be her overwatch, her communications link, her eye in the sky. She, the woman who had once been afraid to leave her own room, would be the one to go behind enemy lines. It was her legacy, her battle, and she had to be the one to secure the weapon that would win it. They used the station's powerful radio to make a series of quiet, coded calls. Amelia called her one, true ally in the world she had left behind. Her father's old, retired personal secretary, a fiercely loyal, elderly woman named Margaret, who despised the vultures who were trying to tear down the Davenport name. Speaking in a prearranged code they had once used to discuss her father's private appointments, Amelia instructed Margaret to go to the house and leave a specific, seldom seldom-used side door unlocked on a specific night. The helicopter arrived at dawn, a great, thundering dragonfly descending from the grey sky. It did not land on the island, but hovered over a small, clear patch of granite, lowering a rescue basket. As Amelia, dressed in her own now dry clothes, prepared to leave, a profound, heartbreaking sadness settled over her. She was leaving the place that had been both her prison and her salvation. She was leaving the man who had been her teacher, her friend, her rescuer. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice tight with an emotion she could not name, echoing the question she had once been asked by a small, frightened girl in another lifetime. "My tour of duty is over in 2 months," he said, his face a mask of professional composure, but his eyes told a different story. "I'll be a civilian again. I was thinking I might come to Boston, see the sights." It was not a promise, but it was a seed of hope. She climbed into the rescue basket, and as it was hoisted into the sky, she looked down at him, a solitary, uniformed figure standing on a small, lonely rock in the vast, empty sea, growing smaller and smaller until he was just a speck, and then he was gone. The journey back to Boston was a blur. The Air Force helicopter dropped her at a discreet private airfield outside the city, where she was met by a car she had arranged for, driven by a driver who did not know her name. She was taken not to a hotel, but to a small, anonymous apartment she had rented under her assumed name, a safe house she had secured before her flight to the island. For 2 days, she remained in hiding, waiting for the appointed night, the night of the infiltration. She watched the news, she read the papers. The city was in an uproar over her disappearance. The district attorney had officially issued a warrant for her arrest. She was now a wanted fugitive. The stakes had never been higher. On the 3rd night, under the cover of a moonless, rainy sky, she put their plan into action. Dressed in black, her face hidden by a scarf, she took a taxi to the quiet, tree-lined street in Beacon Hill, where her family's mansion stood, a great, dark mausoleum of her past. She got out a block away and made her way through the back alleys and gardens she had known since childhood, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Marcus was her lifeline. He was in a rented room in a hotel across the street from the mansion, a room with a direct line of sight to her father's study. They communicated using a small, military-grade walkie-talkie he had given her, his voice a calm, steady presence in her ear. "I'm at the side gate," she whispered into the device. "Gate is clear," his voice crackled back. "Watchman is on his eastern patrol. You have a 7-minute window. Go." She slipped through the unlocked gate and across the manicured lawn to the side door. Just as Margaret had promised, it was unlocked. She was inside. The house was dark, silent, and smelled of dust and disuse. It was a ghost ship, haunted by the memories of her past. She made her way, silent as a cat, up the grand, curving staircase to her father's study. "I'm at the study door," she whispered. "All clear," Marcus replied. "No signs of internal security. Proceed." The study was just as her father had left it, a monument of dark wood, green leather, and the faint, lingering scent of his cigars. The safe was hidden behind a large oil portrait of her grandfather, a stern, bearded patriarch who seemed to be staring down at her with a look of severe disapproval. She worked the combination, her fingers trembling but sure. The heavy steel door swung open, and there it was, a small, black, leather-bound ledger. She grabbed it, her heart soaring with a triumphant, adrenaline-fueled joy. She had the weapon. "I have it," she whispered into the walkie-talkie. "I'm coming out." "Negative." Marcus's voice crackled, a new sharp urgency in his tone. "Hold your position. There's a car, a black sedan. It just pulled up out front. No headlights. 2 men getting out. They're not cops." A wave of icy fear washed over Amelia. They knew. Somehow they had known she would come back. Her father's old partners, the men who had the most to lose if the ledger was found. They had been waiting for her. She was trapped. "They're at the front door," Marcus's voice hissed in her ear, a low, urgent whisper that was a stark contrast to his usual calm. "They're using a key. They're inside the house." Amelia stood frozen in the center of her father's study, the leather-bound ledger clutched in her hand like a talisman. The vast, silent mansion, which had been her childhood home, was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap, and she was the bait. She could hear the faint, muffled sounds from downstairs, the soft click of the front door closing, the murmur of low voices. Her meticulously planned infiltration had just turned into a desperate fight for survival. Her first instinct was to hide, to cower in a closet or under the heavy mahogany desk and pray they wouldn't find her. It was the old Amelia, the nail. Her father had always accused her of being the woman who had fled to the island to escape a fight, but the woman who stood in that study was not the same person. She had cleared a path through a storm-ravaged forest with a machete. She had looked into the abyss of her own fear and had not blinked. "Marcus," she whispered into the walkie-talkie, her voice trembling but firm. "Talk to me. What's my exit route?" "The side door is compromised," he replied, his own voice a model of battlefield calm, a steadying force in her panic. "They'll have a man watching the grounds. Your only way out is up, the third-floor balcony off your old bedroom. It connects to the roof of the conservatory. From there, you can get to the branches of the big oak tree, and from the tree, down to the back wall." It was a route she had used as a rebellious teenager, sneaking out to meet her friends. It was a dangerous, athletic climb, a feat she hadn't attempted in 15 years. To do it now, in the dark, in the rain, with two unknown men hunting her, seemed impossible. "I can't," she breathed. "Yes, you can." His voice came back, firm, unyielding, the voice of a drill sergeant who would not accept failure. "You are a soldier, Amelia. Now move." His words, his absolute, unshakable faith in her, were a jolt of pure adrenaline. She took a deep breath, tucked the precious ledger into the inside of her jacket and moved. She slipped out of the study and into the darkened upstairs hallway, her feet silent on the thick Persian runner. She could hear them now, moving through the downstairs rooms, their footsteps slow, methodical, searching. They were not common burglars, they were professionals. She reached her old bedroom, a frothy, feminine space of pale silks and faded floral wallpaper that seemed to belong to another person, another lifetime. She slid open the French doors to the balcony and stepped out into the cold, wet night. The wind and the rain whipped at her face. Below her, the conservatory's glass roof glistened slick and treacherous in the dim light from the street. "I'm on the balcony," she whispered. "I see you," he replied. "They're coming up the main staircase. You have less than a minute. Go now." She didn't hesitate. She swung a leg over the wrought iron railing and lowered herself onto the steeply pitched roof of the conservatory. The wet slate was as slippery as ice. For a terrifying moment, she felt her feet begin to slide, and she clawed at the slick surface, her nails scraping against the stone. She found a purchase on a copper gutter and steadied herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to make her way across the roof, her body pressed flat against the slate, a dark, slow-moving shadow in the night. She could hear the shouts from inside the house now, the sound of her bedroom door being thrown open. They knew she had been there. She reached the edge of the roof, and the great sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree were just a few feet away, a bridge to freedom. She gathered herself, and with a leap of pure, desperate faith, she launched herself into the darkness, her arms outstretched, reaching for the thick, rough branch. Her hands found it, her fingers wrapping around the wet, slippery bark. The impact jarred her arms in their sockets, but she held on, her body swinging precariously over the dark, empty space above the garden. She pulled herself up, straddling the branch, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She had made it. "I'm in the tree," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I see you," he said, and she could hear the profound, gut-wrenching relief in his voice. "They're on the balcony. They have flashlights. Get down, now." She scrambled down the trunk of the great tree, the rough bark tearing at her clothes and her hands, and dropped the last few feet to the soft, wet earth of the garden. She ran, her lungs burning, to the high brick wall at the back of the property, the wall that separated her gilded prison from the freedom of the city. She scaled it, using the familiar footholds of the ivy she had known since childhood, and dropped down into the anonymity of the back alley. She was out, she was free, and she had the ledger. She met Marcus a few blocks away at a pre-arranged rendezvous point. She stumbled into his arms, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. He held her for a moment, his embrace strong and steady, a silent acknowledgement of the battle she had just won. "You did it, Amelia," he said, his voice a low, admiring whisper. "You did it." The next morning, they did not go to the police. They went to the office of the special prosecutor, the man who had issued the warrant for her arrest. They were a strange, formidable pair, the fugitive millionairess, her face bruised and scratched from her escape, and the quiet, imposing black man who stood by her side, a silent, watchful guardian. They met with the prosecutor, a hard-nosed, ambitious lawyer named Robert Peterson. He was skeptical, hostile, ready to dismiss Amelia as just another corrupt, entitled rich girl. But then she placed the black leather ledger on his polished desk. "Everything you need to know about the Tobin Bridge disaster is in that book, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It contains a detailed 20-year record of my father's business practices. You will find the names of the steel suppliers who sold him inferior materials. You will find the names of the city inspectors he bribed to look the other way. And you will find the names of his partners, the men who sat on his board, who profited from his corruption, and who are now trying to send me to prison to cover their own crimes." For the next 2 hours, Amelia, with Marcus at her side, laid out the entire story. She did not make excuses for her father. She presented the evidence with a cool, dispassionate clarity. She was not just a witness, she was an expert, the one person who could decipher the coded, cryptic entries in her father's ledger. As he listened, as he looked at the damning, irrefutable evidence in the book, Peterson's demeanor began to change. His hostility softened, replaced by the grim, focused intensity of a prosecutor who has just been handed the case of a lifetime. He was looking at a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the city's political and business establishment. When she had finished, he was silent for a long time, his fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the cover of the ledger. "If this is true, Miss Davenport," he said, his voice low and serious, "you are not a suspect. You are my star witness." He looked from her to Marcus, his shrewd eyes taking in the quiet, powerful dynamic between them. "I will need your full cooperation, and in return, I will grant you full immunity from prosecution, and I will guarantee your safety." The deal was struck. The war had moved into a new and final phase. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret grand jury testimony and backroom legal maneuvering. Amelia, protected by a team of U.S. Marshals, became a ghost in the legal system. Her testimony a series of bombshells that were dismantling her father's corrupt empire and the empires of his cronies piece by piece. The indictments came down like a guillotine. A dozen of the most powerful men in Boston, business leaders, city officials, union bosses, were arrested and charged with bribery, fraud, and manslaughter. The scandal was the biggest the city had ever seen, a story that dominated the national news for months. The name Davenport was once again on the front page of every newspaper, but this time it was not as a symbol of failure, but as a symbol of a long overdue reckoning with a corrupt past. Throughout the entire ordeal, Marcus was her rock. He could not be with her physically. She was in protective custody, but they spoke on the phone every night. He was her confidant, her strategist, her steady, calming presence in the midst of the legal storm. He was the one who reminded her of her own strength, who helped her navigate the treacherous, exhausting process of bearing witness against the world she had once been a part of. Finally, after months of legal battles, it was over. The men who had tried to destroy her were on their way to prison. Davenport Steel, purged of its corrupt leadership and under new court-appointed management, was beginning the long, slow process of rebuilding its reputation. And Amelia Davenport was, for the first time in her life, truly, completely free. She was no longer the Steel Princess, no longer a fugitive, no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a giant slayer, a woman who had faced down a corrupt and powerful system and had won. She had not just saved herself, she had, in a way, saved her father's legacy, not by hiding his sins, but by exposing them, by forcing a painful but necessary reckoning with the truth. She had honored his memory not by being a nail, but by being the strongest, most resilient and most honorable kind of builder, the kind who was willing to tear down a rotten structure in order to build something new and clean and strong in its place. With the legal battles concluded and the dust of the scandal beginning to settle, Amelia found herself in a strange, uncharted territory. She was free, but she was also untethered. The life she had known before her flight to the island was gone, shattered by the revelations and the trials. The company, the mansion, the social circle, all the pillars of her old identity were either dismantled or irrevocably changed. She was a woman without a map, standing at a crossroads, with no clear path forward. The courts had restored her control of the Davenport estate, or what was left of it. The company was in receivership, its future uncertain. The grand house on Beacon Hill felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that no longer belonged to her. She was, once again, a solitary figure, but her solitude was no longer that of a fugitive, but of a victor surveying the ruins of a conquered battlefield. Her first act as a free woman was to seek out the one person who had been her anchor in the storm. Marcus's tour of duty was over, and he had, as he had promised, come to Boston. He had taken a simple, unassuming job as a security consultant for a private firm, and was living in a small, Spartan apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. He was a man who had no desire for the spotlight, who was content to return to a life of quiet, disciplined anonymity. She went to his apartment, not as a millionairess, but as a friend. She found him in his small, neat living room, surrounded by books on military history and the soft, melancholic sound of a John Coltrane record on the turntable. They sat and talked for hours, not as a CEO and her advisor, but as two people who had been through a war together, trying to make sense of the peace. "What will you do now?" he asked her, his voice gentle. "I don't know," she confessed, the uncertainty a raw, honest admission. "I feel like I've spent the last year of my life dismantling my father's world. I don't know how to build my own." "You've already started," he said, his gaze steady and full of a quiet, profound admiration. "You built your own courage, you built your own voice, the rest is just logistics." His simple, unwavering faith in her was, as it had always been, a powerful, steadying force. In the weeks that followed, they spent more and more time together, their friendship deepening into a quiet, comfortable intimacy. They would take long walks along the Charles River. They would explore the city's museums. They would sit in small, out-of-the-way cafes and talk for hours. In his presence, Amelia felt a sense of peace, a sense of being truly, completely herself that she had never known with anyone else. He was the one person in the world who had seen her at her most vulnerable and at her most courageous. He knew her not as the Steel Princess, but as Amelia, the soldier who had found her strength in the heart of a storm. It was during one of these long walks that she finally made a decision about her future, about the future of the Davenport name. "I'm going to sell it," she said, the words both terrifying and liberating. "The company, the house, all of it. It's not my legacy, it's his. And I need to build my own." She knew that the company, even in its diminished state, was still worth a fortune, but the money, she had come to realize, was not the source of her power. It had been the source of her imprisonment. Her true power lay in the lessons she had learned on the island, in the courtroom, in the quiet, steady presence of the man walking beside her. She sold the company not to the highest bidder, but to a consortium of its own employees, financing the buyout herself with a low-interest loan, transforming the feudal empire of her father into a modern, worker-owned cooperative. She sold the grand, empty mansion on Beacon Hill and used the proceeds to establish a charitable foundation, a fund dedicated to providing legal aid for the families of the 12 men who had been killed in the bridge collapse. It was an act of restitution, of atonement, a way of transforming the tainted legacy of her father's wealth into a force for healing and for justice. With the remnants of her fortune, she bought a small, beautiful and utterly unpretentious house in a quiet academic neighborhood in Cambridge, a world away from the stuffy, insular society of Beacon Hill. And she enrolled as a student at Harvard University, a 33-year-old freshman, to study the one subject that had always been her secret passion, botany. She was, at last, building a life that was truly, completely her own, a life not of steel, but of living, growing things. Throughout this process of reinvention, Marcus was her constant, quiet companion, her advisor, her friend, and increasingly the undisputed center of her new, happier world. The unspoken love that had been born on the lonely, storm-swept island had followed them back to the city, and in the quiet, peaceful landscape of their new lives, it was finally given the space to grow. They knew the challenges they would face. The world, for all its progress, was still a place of deep, unreasoning prejudice. Their relationship would be a quiet scandal, a source of gossip and disapproval. But they were two people who had faced down far more dangerous enemies than the whispers of a disapproving society. They had earned their happiness, and they would not let the world's ignorance take it from them. Their marriage, like her first, was a small, private affair, held in the garden of her new home in Cambridge. It was a union not of fortunes or of social pedigrees, but of two resilient, honorable souls who had, against all odds, found their sanctuary in each other. Their life together was a quiet masterpiece of shared purpose and mutual respect. Amelia became a respected botanist. Her work focused on the preservation of endangered plant species, a quiet, lifelong act of nurturing and protecting the fragile beauty of the world. Marcus left his corporate security job and came to work with her, managing the logistical and financial side of her research foundation. They were, once again, a team, a formidable, perfectly balanced partnership. They would return to St. Jude's Island every summer. It was no longer a place of exile, but a place of pilgrimage, their own private, sacred ground. They would stay in the small stone cottage, which they had carefully, lovingly restored. They would work in the garden. They would walk the paths they had once cleared with machetes. They would sit on the cliffs and watch the endless rhythmic crash of the waves. It was during one of these summer visits, many years later, that a small private boat appeared in the cove. A young woman, a journalist from a national magazine, had somehow discovered the story of the reclusive, eccentric and brilliant botanist, Dr. Amelia Davenport, and had tracked her to her private island. She wanted to write a story about her dramatic, almost mythical transformation from a disgraced corporate heiress to a world-renowned scientist. Amelia, who had not given an interview in over 20 years, was, to the journalist's surprise, willing to talk. They sat on the porch of the stone cottage, with Marcus sitting quietly in a nearby chair, a silent, steady presence. The journalist asked her about the scandal, about the trial, about her decision to sell her family's empire, and Amelia answered, her voice calm, her gaze clear. But then, the journalist asked the question that was at the heart of her story. "Everyone wants to know," the young woman said, leaning forward, her pen poised. "What happened on this island? What was the turning point? What changed you?" Amelia was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the sea and then to the face of her husband, who met her look with a small, quiet smile of a love that was as deep and as constant as the tides. "I was not changed on this island," Amelia said finally, her voice full of a quiet, simple and profound truth. "I was revealed. I was a person who had spent her entire life being told what she was. A daughter, an heiress, a princess, a fugitive. But here, in the quiet, in the storm, I was stripped of all those labels, and I had to discover for the first time who I truly was." She looked at Marcus, and her smile was a thing of breathtaking, radiant beauty. "And I was not alone. I had a good teacher, a man who did not see a millionairess or a fugitive. He just saw a soldier, and he taught me how to fight. Not with money, not with power, but with the one weapon that truly matters. He taught me how to fight with the truth of my own heart." The story the journalist wrote was not the one she had come for. It was not a story of scandal and of fortunes lost and found. It was a love story, a quiet, powerful and deeply moving testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the profound, transformative power of a simple, decent and unexpected human connection. It was the story of a man and a woman who, on a lonely, forgotten island, had saved each other, and in doing so had built a world of their own, a world that was stronger and truer and more beautiful than any empire of steel. The journalist's article, when it was published, caused a quiet sensation. It was not the salacious exposé of a fallen heiress that the magazine's readers might have expected. Instead, it was a thoughtful, lyrical, and deeply respectful portrait of a remarkable life and of an even more remarkable love story, the story of Amelia Davenport and Marcus Thorne. The fugitive millionairess and the solitary soldier captured the public's imagination, becoming a kind of modern-day fable, a testament to the enduring power of courage, integrity, and the human heart's surprising capacity for reinvention. For Amelia and Marcus, the brief, unexpected return to the public eye was a strange, disorienting experience. They were deluged with letters, with requests for interviews, with offers for book and movie deals. They politely but firmly declined them all. They had not shared their story for fame or for profit. They had shared it as a quiet testament, a final closing of a long-closed chapter of their lives. Having done so, they retreated once again into the quiet, purposeful privacy of the world they had built for themselves. Their life in Cambridge continued its gentle, steady rhythm. Amelia's work as a botanist became increasingly influential. She published several groundbreaking papers on the unique, resilient flora of the North Atlantic coast, her research informed by the deep, practical knowledge she had first gained on St. Jude's Island. She became a beloved, if somewhat eccentric, professor at the university, known for her passionate lectures and for her fierce, maternal devotion to her graduate students. Marcus, as the director of her research foundation, was the quiet, indispensable force that made her work possible. He managed the grants, he organized the expeditions, he navigated the complex, often treacherous world of academic politics with the same calm, strategic intelligence he had once used to plan military operations. He was the logistical genius, the steady hand on the tiller, who allowed Amelia the freedom to pursue her scientific passions. They were, in their professional lives as in their personal ones, a perfect, seamless team. Their home was a sanctuary, a haven not just for them, but for a wide, eclectic circle of friends, scientists, artists, writers, and the many young people they had mentored over the years. It was a house filled with books, with music, with lively, intelligent conversation, a place where ideas were valued more than possessions, and character was valued more than pedigree. They watched, with a quiet, profound pride, as the world they had helped to change continued to evolve. The Davenport Steel Company, now a successful worker-owned cooperative, became a model of ethical, responsible industry. The foundation Amelia had established for the families of the bridge victims had grown, its mission expanding to advocate for workplace safety and corporate accountability across the country. The seeds of justice they had planted so many years ago had grown into strong, resilient trees. But their greatest legacy, they both knew, was not in the companies they had reformed or the foundations they had built. It was in the quiet, ordinary, and deeply extraordinary life they had created together, a life that stood as a silent, powerful rebuke to the cynical, prejudiced world they had once been forced to navigate. Their marriage, which could have been a source of constant, wearying struggle, was, in fact, the source of their greatest strength, a partnership so solid, so deeply rooted in mutual love and respect, that it seemed to render the outside world's judgments irrelevant. They grew old together, their love deepening and maturing, settling into the comfortable, easy rhythm of a long and happy partnership. The fires of their dramatic past had cooled, leaving behind the warm, steady embers of a shared history, a shared life. They were two people who knew each other's souls, who had seen each other through the darkest of storms, and who had found, in each other, a peace that was more profound and more lasting than any worldly success. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep one spring morning at the age of 85. He had lived a long, full, and honorable life, a life of quiet, unassuming heroism. His death was a profound seismic loss for Amelia, the end of a partnership that had been the central defining fact of her existence for over half a century. But she did not collapse into a renewed, helpless grief. The woman who faced this final, devastating loss was not the fragile, frightened heiress he had found on the island. She was the strong, resilient, and deeply courageous woman he had helped her to become. She grieved for him, a deep, aching sorrow that would never truly leave her. But she also honored him by continuing the life and the work they had built together. She continued her research. She continued to teach. She continued to be the quiet, moral center of the small, loving community they had created. She was no longer just one half of a perfect partnership. She was the living embodiment of its legacy. A year after his death, she returned, as she always had, to St. Jude's Island. She went alone, making the journey on a small chartered boat, just as she had done all those years ago. The island was the same, a wild, beautiful, and eternal testament to the enduring power of the natural world. The small stone cottage was still standing, just as she and Marcus had left it, a simple, perfect monument to the life they had built. The communication station, long ago decommissioned by the Air Force and gifted to her in a quiet, unofficial transfer, stood as a silent, concrete reminder of the storm that had brought them together. She spent a week on the island, her final pilgrimage to the place where her true life had begun. She walked the paths they had cleared. She sat on the cliffs where they had talked for hours. She tended the small, wild garden they had planted. She was not there to mourn, but to remember, to commune with the spirit of the man who was as much a part of this island as the granite and the pines. On her final evening, she sat on the porch of the stone cottage, watching the sun set over the sea, painting the sky in brilliant, breathtaking strokes of orange and pink and gold. She felt a profound sense of peace, a sense of a life that had been lived fully, bravely, and well. She thought of the young, frightened woman who had fled to this island, a fugitive from a world that had tried to break her, and she thought of the quiet, solitary soldier who had taught her not just how to survive, but how to fight, how to live, how to love. Their story had been an improbable one, a story of two worlds colliding, a story of a love that had defied every convention, every prejudice, every obstacle the world had thrown at them. It was, she realized, a story about the true nature of wealth. Her father had believed that wealth was steel and money and power, but he had been wrong. True wealth was the courage to face your own fears. It was the integrity to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. It was the resilience to build a new life from the ashes of an old one. And most of all, it was the profound, immeasurable, and eternal gift of finding another human soul who sees you, who understands you, and who loves you, not for the name you carry or the fortune you possess, but for the simple, unadorned truth of who you are. She had arrived on this island a millionairess, and she would leave it a woman who was truly, immeasurably wealthy. She had found her fortune not in the vaults of her father's banks, but in the quiet, steadfast heart of a good and honorable soldier. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, plunging the world into a soft, gentle twilight, Amelia Davenport Thorne, the botanist, the teacher, the survivor, the lover, smiled. Her long, improbable, and beautiful journey was complete. She was, at last, home. Amelia's final pilgrimage to St. Jude's Island was not an ending, but a quiet, contemplative closing of a circle. She returned to her life in Cambridge with a renewed sense of purpose, a calm acceptance of her new, solitary existence. She was a woman who had lived a life of extraordinary drama, who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and she had emerged not broken, but profoundly, beautifully whole. Her grief for Marcus was a constant, quiet companion, but it was not a debilitating one. It was the gentle, bittersweet ache of a great love that had been fully lived, a testament to a connection that transcended even death. In the final chapter of her long and remarkable life, she turned her full attention to securing the legacy she and Marcus had built together. She poured her remaining fortune and all of her formidable intelligence into the research foundation they had created. It became her sole focus, her life's work. She expanded its mission, transforming it from a small, local organization into a major international force for botanical research and environmental conservation. She funded expeditions to the most remote corners of the world, sending a new generation of young, passionate scientists to discover and to protect the planet's most fragile ecosystems. She endowed chairs at universities, she created scholarships for underprivileged students, she built state-of-the-art laboratories. She, the woman who had once been a symbol of industrial ruin, now became one of the world's most influential and respected champions of the natural world. Her own scientific work continued, But it took on a new, more personal dimension. She became fascinated with the unique, incredibly resilient plant life of St. Jude's Island. She discovered several new species of lichens and mosses, organisms that could thrive in the harshest of conditions, clinging to the bare, salt-sprayed granite, surviving the brutal winters and the violent storms. In their quiet, tenacious, and unassuming strength, she saw a reflection of her own journey and of the quiet, enduring strength of the man she had loved. She named the most resilient of these new species, a small, beautiful, star-shaped lichen, Thorn's Resilience, a quiet, scientific tribute to her husband. She became a legend in the academic world, a kind of enigmatic, revered matriarch. She was known for her brilliant, incisive mind, for her fierce, unwavering commitment to her work, and for her deep, personal investment in the lives of her students. She was a demanding mentor, but also a profoundly kind and generous one. She saw in them not just future scientists, but future leaders, and she was determined to equip them not just with knowledge, but with the same sense of integrity, of courage, and of moral purpose that had guided her own life. She never remarried. Her love for Marcus was a complete and perfect thing, a story that needed no sequel. He remained the quiet center of her life, a constant guiding presence. She would often speak of him to her students, not with sadness, but with a quiet, joyful pride, using his life as an example of the principles she was trying to instill in them. The importance of discipline, of honor, of a duty that was not just to a country or an institution, but to the simple, fundamental principles of human decency. She lived to be 95 years old, her mind sharp and clear to the very end. She died peacefully in her home in Cambridge, surrounded by her books, her art, and the loving presence of her children and grandchildren. Her passing was front-page news, the end of an era. The obituaries celebrated her as a visionary philanthropist, a brilliant scientist, and a trailblazing feminist icon, a woman who had defied the constraints of her time and had forged a life of extraordinary meaning and purpose. But for those who had known her best, for the small inner circle of her family and her closest students, her true legacy was not in the millions she had donated or the scientific papers she had published. It was in the quiet, profound, and deeply personal lessons she had taught them. Lessons that had been learned not in a classroom, but on a storm-swept island, at the side of a quiet, honorable soldier. She had taught them that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the courage to act in spite of it. She had taught them that true freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the power to choose your own commitments, to define your own purpose. And she had taught them that the greatest, most enduring legacy a person can build is not an empire of steel or of wealth, but a life of integrity, a life of purpose, and a life, above all, of love. In her will, she left a final, surprising instruction. She was not to be buried in the grand, imposing Davenport family mausoleum in Boston. Instead, she had requested that her ashes, along with the ashes of her late husband, Marcus Thorn, be scattered from the cliffs of St. Jude's Island, the place where their two disparate worlds had so miraculously and so beautifully become one. And so, on a clear, windswept day in early summer, her family and her closest friends made a final pilgrimage to the small, rocky island. They stood on the cliffs, the same cliffs where Amelia had once sat in lonely despair, and where she and Marcus had later sat in peaceful, companionable love. They shared stories, they laughed, they cried, and they celebrated the two extraordinary lives that had touched their own so profoundly. As her granddaughter, a budding young poet, read a final simple verse, Amelia's son-in-law opened the two urns and released their contents into the wind. The ashes of the fugitive millionairess and the solitary soldier mingled in the clean, salt-sprayed air, two distinct souls becoming one in their final journey, and were carried out over the vast, eternal, and indifferent sea. They were at last home, together, in the place where their true story had begun. It was a story that had started in a storm, a story of two lonely, wounded people who had found in each other an unexpected sanctuary. It had been a quiet, private story, a secret kept by a wild, forgotten island. but it was a story whose ripples had spread out into the world. A story of courage that had inspired, a story of justice that had healed, a story of a love that had, in its own quiet, unassuming way, changed the world. And it was a story that would live on, a timeless, enduring testament to the profound, transformative, and triumphant power of the human heart. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the flame of these powerful memories of hope and the triumph of the human spirit will never be extinguished. Thank you.